And it is the Saturday Coffee Klatch. Heather Lofthouse is not with us today. She's taking a well-earned time off. And in her place, I'm so pleased, Michael Lahanas Calderon, my colleague and friend. Michael, you are going to have the unenviable task today of doing Heather Lofthouse's task. So good luck with it. By the way, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, shoes I can certainly never fill. Heather, we miss you, and we're excited for you to be back very soon. Certainly a busy news week. We've got Trump's speech to Congress. We've got tariff chaos, Trump's changing position on Ukraine. We have all sorts of things to talk about that are actually positive this week, I'll add as well. So don't tune out, audience, in terms of
good. I can't wait
constraints.
I want to get to the positives.
Yes, evolving constraints on Trump. And we'll close with a little bit of a conversation about, how the American people and how different generations, like yourself and myself, are feeling about the state of the country.
Let me just have, that's a good idea, and I like that, Michael, but let me just stress, you reminded me, between us, there is a half century of time. I mean, you are, 28?
I'm 28, yes.
And I am 78? I mean,
you
I'm
don't
talking
look a day
to
over 28, Bob.
Well, thank you. Well, you don't look a day on over 78. There is there really. I mean, it's just amazing to me that we are talking over a half century a span. It's amazing that we can understand each other. Maybe we can't. Maybe that's what we're going to discover.
Yeah, I mean, I will be curious to see what comes out of that, because I have a lot of questions for you about what you've lived through that I have not. And
I have lived through 50 years that you have not lived through, Michael.
And, I know, it's astonishing.
It's astonishing and humbling at the same time. Anyway,
Certainly.
So what's your first item?
Well, I mean, speaking of things I have lived through that I perhaps wish I hadn't, did you see Trump's speech to Congress earlier this week? What did you think of that?
Well, I don't even really want to talk much about it because I thought it was just classic Trump. It was nothing but lies, as usual. Every time he'd open his mouth, the man is really incapable of saying a sentence that is not filled with at least one or two lies. But the other thing that struck me about it, I mean, its length. It went on almost 100 minutes.
Oh my God, that was the longest one in history, right?
In history. And again, not to overemphasize my age, but I've watched a lot of these. I've been around for a lot of these, whether they're called State of the Unions or joint addresses to the joint houses of Congress. This is the longest forever. And Trump, once again, undisciplined and belligerent and self-congratulatory. But the thing that struck me more than ever before, Michael, is that he puts everything in the frame of dominance, his dominance, and everybody else's submission. I mean, much of the speech was about, the awfulness of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden, and mentioned, Pocahontas, a derisive kind of reference to Elizabeth Warren. And I mean, the put-downs and the put-downs and the put-downs. I mean, almost everything he said was his dominance and somebody else's submission. And I think that is the central theme. That is that's the only way that Donald Trump, particularly Trump 2, thinks about the world and the environment and the United States and his job.
Well, can I ask then, do you think that he was successful at implementing that frame? I mean, there was Democratic resistance, right? We saw Representative Al Green stand up and interrupt Trump, and we had Democratic representatives holding signs and walking out. I mean, did that make an impact?
Well, I think it did. And there are some political pundits, particularly based in Washington, who say, no, the Democrats should not do that. They shouldn't stoop, quote, to the Republican level. But this is not politics as usual, Michael, and I keep emphasizing this. We are not in familiar political terrain. This is not Republicans versus Democrats or left versus right or conservatives versus liberals or progressives. This is really fundamentally about our system of government. This is about democracy versus fascism. It's about self-government versus oligarchy. And it seems to me very important that Democrats, capital D, show up and show and stand up to what is going on. And if they have to show up, put signs up when Trump is addressing them, and if Al Green, Representative Al Green, has to stand up, and I think it was appropriate. People are not even paying much attention to what he said. He said, "You did not have a mandate and do not have a mandate to wreck Medicaid," and that's something that is on its way right now. A very important message. And the fact that he was basically taken out of the House at that point in time, and then was censured the next day. And then, very important, Michael, Representative Green, when he was censured, what he did, and this is there are not very many people who are ever censured in the House, but what he did was to make a speech, use the time to make a speech about what Donald Trump is doing, the fact that nobody has ever censured him for calling the Democrats, terrible names. And then he led his colleagues in singing, "We Shall Overcome." It was a throwback, obviously, to the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement. But I am glad he did it. I'm glad the Democrats are showing just a little bit of backbone.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it was honestly really inspiring to me as someone who went into watching that speech, not expecting very much. I wasn't really sure. There was no sense that there was a coordinated plan from Democrats, at least that I could see. So I was excited to see that. But in terms of other reactions, I also saw a lot of people talking about how Trump seemed very dismissive of the impact that his economic policies and tariffs would have. I think he said something like, the tariffs are going to cause a little disturbance, and we're okay with that. I mean, what is your reaction to that?
Well, obviously, he doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't understand economics. Tariffs are causing more than a little disturbance. The mere fact that the tariffs temporarily went into effect the night before his speech, Monday night, midnight. Look what they did to the stock market. A stock market had the biggest sell-off, one of the biggest sell-offs in the last few years. And I think that sell-off itself caught Trump off guard. I mean, he reversed himself. I mean, most of those tariffs have been withdrawn, and I think it shows that one of the biggest constraints on Trump is the stock market. Now, let me just remind you. I mean, you already know, Michael, but everybody out there, the stock market is not the economy. Only the richest 1% of Americans own more than half of the stock market. The richest 10% of Americans own more than half, actually 92% of the stock market. So the stock market doesn't really affect most people. But for Trump and for the billionaire and millionaires around Trump, the people who back Trump, the stock market really is the measure of success or failure. So that sell-off had a big effect in the White House.
And it's one of the things he can't really browbeat into submission either, right? The market is going to do what the market wants to do.
Exactly. And this is not a matter of dominance and submission. In fact, the market has its own animal spirits, as some economists used to say. And so it's the stock market, but it's also the bond market. Long-term interest rates. Now, I don't want your eyes to, anybody out there, glaze over, but when I say
it's happening already, Bob. It's happening.
Long-term interest rates, really, which are beyond the control of the Federal Reserve Board. They have to do with the estimates and the fears and the hopes of lenders and borrowers, 10 years out. Well, those are showing that people are really worried about the economy, and a lot of indications. We can get into this in more detail if you want to, Michael, but a lot of indicators are trending downward.
Well, I have another thing that I was curious about, because I feel like in the background to all of this nonsense, we've been seeing the House GOP, or really the congressional GOP, trying to pass a budget, right? And was it last week? I think it was. They passed, at least the House passed a version of a budget that had some very deep cuts. But now it seems like they're backing off of that and trying to do something called a continuing resolution, right? Remind us what that is?
Well, a continuing resolution merely says we give up. I mean, essentially, we're going to take exactly the budget we have last year, which happened to be Joe Biden's budget, and we're just going to continue the same spending priorities and the same spending goals. It is basically a surrender by the Republicans. And I think that's what the Republicans fear most of all right now, particularly with the economy showing so many signs of strain, is that a shutdown of the government would really have terrible effects on the economy, and Republicans would be blamed. And they are desperately afraid of being blamed. And so a continuing resolution is the easiest way out for them.
Yeah, because they don't have the votes for their rather extreme program of cuts, right? Even within their own caucus.
That's exactly right. And that program of cuts that they put forth is extreme in the sense that they wanted to cut Medicaid. I mean, Medicaid, $880 billion out of Medicaid. What that means, you have half of the nation's children are dependent on Medicaid. A huge number of seniors are dependent on Medicaid. $880 billion out of Medicaid would have a huge effect on some of our most vulnerable people in this country, and many of them are Republican constituents, not the children, but their parents and their grandparents. And so Republicans didn't want to go through with that. It was a threat. They put it out there. I think the most radical members of the Freedom Caucus wanted to put it out there in order to make room for a huge tax cut, the benefits of which will disproportionately go to the wealthy and big corporations. I think that the budget they put out there was even too much for many Republicans.
And that was like over $4 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations, wasn't it? I mean, that's an astonishing number.
In fact, $4.5 trillion. Now, the eyes, again, glaze over at these kinds of numbers, but we're talking about really enormous effects in terms of people's lives and the lives of many people that all of us know and love. Republicans, and this is something that's important. Republicans, last week and the week before, they had town halls in their districts, many of them. Many of them went home. They had a recess. They had town halls. And what did they hear in the town halls? Many people, and this is even before they heard about the cuts in Medicaid, many people upset about Musk and his chainsaw with regard to the federal government, particularly veterans. Veterans administration, veterans health benefits, veterans who are disproportionately affected by those cuts. A lot of people were apoplectic in those town halls. A lot of the constituents of those Republicans. And the Republicans came back and they said, they made a lot of fuss and they got the attention of Mike Johnson, the speaker, and they ultimately got the attention, we hope, of Donald Trump.
Oh, and not just that. I saw earlier this week that the head of the National Republican Campaign Council, very inside baseball, also eyes glazing over acronym there, the NRCC, told House members maybe you should lay off the town halls because they're going so poorly for all of you. And I think
right. He even suggested that they have remote town halls, that they don't do it in person. When you're scared of your own constituents, this is a sign that things are not going terribly well.
Well, I mean, is this a sign for hope in some ways? I mean, we can get to these early. I feel like there's a lot more than usual. Republicans are running scared of the market. They're running scared of whether the stock market, the bond market. They're scared that their tariffs are causing real problems. They're backing off. You've got the Treasury Secretary going out there and saying things like Scott Bessent saying cheap goods are not the essence of the American dream when talking about, the potential impact on the what is happening? Are they on the back foot?
They are on the back foot. I mean, the so-called honeymoon that every president is granted, in this case, is very, very short. There are a lot of signs that even though those of us who have followed politics for years initially thought no constraints on Donald Trump initially thought no constraints on Donald Trump, well, the stock market and people in Republican districts, many rural districts in America, ruby red Republican districts, and also, Elon Musk's kind of brazenness. I mean, his political ineptitude. All of this is a constraint. Or these are all constraints on Donald Trump. We haven't even talked about the courts.
Well, tell us about the courts then, because I feel like there were a couple of big news stories, particularly out of the Supreme Court this week in terms of constraints, right?
Yes. Well, it's very, very interesting. For the second time since the inauguration, the Supreme Court has bucked Donald Trump in a 5-4 decision, with Amy Coney Barrett and also the Chief Justice, John Roberts, joining the 3 liberals on the court to make a 5-4 majority, saying in this case to Donald Trump, you can't cut like you are cutting, and we are affirming lower court decisions that say, in effect, that these decisions belong about cutting and spending, belong to Congress. They don't belong to the executive branch.
And I think my question for you there is, I mean, you talk about this theme of dominance and submission as it relates to Trump, but is there also just not a parallel track of this is pure and blatant corruption kind of happening before our very eyes in terms of, where the money that is being cut could be sent? Is it being redirected to Elon Musk's companies? Is it being, given out in the form of tax cuts? Like, what's the big picture here?
The big picture is corruption, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, Michael, because a lot of the people who will be beneficiaries of the proposed tax cuts are the biggest backers of Donald Trump. Elon Musk himself. There are a lot of conflicts of interest. The Commerce Department, for example, just allowed a lot of Commerce Department contractors to contract with Starlink, Elon Musk's, satellite communication system. There's a lot of evidence that Musk is profiting off of his SpaceX. He's not even going after the Defense Department and Defense Department contracts. In fact, he's profiting enormously, not only in terms of Tesla. Well, Tesla shares of stock have actually gone down, but SpaceX and his other companies. But he is making decisions that look an awful lot like they are self-interested decisions. I don't know, Michael, you probably know historically, the Teapot Dome scandal.
It's my favorite scandal, actually.
Now, why is it your favorite scandal?
Well, it involves a great Ohio president, if I remember correctly, Mr. Harding. Is that right?
Warren G. Harding, the great people. Your sense of history is very admirable. I was not there during the Teapot Dome scandal, but up until now, the Teapot Dome scandal, the financial kickbacks and bribery that marred the Warren G. Harding administration really were unrivaled. I think Nixon came pretty close, but the Trump administration is far already, in just the first 7 weeks, far beyond Teapot Dome.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Teapot Dome. For all of those not in the know about Teapot Dome and when it happened, that's basically a century ago now, like almost exactly, right, in that 1920s era. Do you see that if you were looking for historical parallels, is right now this moment of blatant corruption reminding you of both, that run up to the Great Depression in the 1920s and the Gilded Age, more one than the other, the Gilded Age of the 1890s, to be clear?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think there are parallels. Certainly we are now in the second Gilded Age, and the first Gilded Age did come to a halt on the basis of corruption that generated a lot of wild speculation on Wall Street that caused the Wall Street crash of 1929. And that crash led to and contributed to not only the progressivism of, initially Teddy Roosevelt, but more importantly, Teddy Roosevelt's fifth cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and wiped out a lot of the fortunes of that first Gilded Age. So yes, there are parallels. As has been said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
And the rhymes are unfortunate in this exact moment. But
yeah.
I suppose, I feel like there have also been plenty of members of the administration that have been quite vocal about trying to repeal all of those gains that we achieved during the New Deal era in particular, in terms of, you want to talk about constraints on, I guess an uncontrolled market, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's interesting. If you look at the people, look at Vance, for example, J.D. Vance. He is a protege of Peter Thiel, the financial, Silicon Valley venture capitalist who sunk $15 million into Vance's 2022 Ohio campaign for Senate, and also persuaded Trump to make Vance his vice president. Well, what does Peter Thiel stand for? Peter Thiel stands for no democracy. He's a libertarian who says democracy is incompatible with freedom. This view of democracy being incompatible with freedom, this anti-democracy view, is very deep in the Trump administration. It is not just dominance and submission. This is theme number 2, and it really is Elon Musk and it is J.D. Vance. Elon Musk used to be a colleague of Peter Thiel's at PayPal. I mean, these people know what they are doing, and they're wrecking or trying to wreck the United States government, not just because they want to play footsie with Putin, but also because they really don't believe in democracy.
And they see themselves as would-be kings, would they not? I mean, some of them have said as much. Or, to put it in the parlance of Franklin Roosevelt, economic royalists, correct?
Economic royalists. I mean, Roosevelt's a great 1936 statement when he was running for re-election, when he says, when he was talking about the people on Wall Street and the rich CEOs, he said, "They hate me and I invite their hatred." That was a bold statement at the time, and it would be nice for Democrats to say similar things today.
Well, I mean, that brings us to another question. Having just experienced the Democratic response to Trump's address this week, I mean, do you feel like they're on the right track? Are there other things that you feel that they could be doing, should be doing, you would wish for them to be doing?
Well, I think that Democrats are slowly on the right track. And Democrats, putting up Elise Slotkin to provide the response. She is a moderate. She's a freshman, and she did perfectly well. But I think what the American public wants in terms of opposition to Trump, whether people call themselves Democrats or independents or liberals or progressives or even some anti-Trump Republicans, what they want is somebody with fire in their belly, somebody who is able and willing to talk about this in terms of, well, the way we've been talking about it, democracy versus fascism or neo-fascism and authoritarianism and dictatorship. I want to credit Bernie Sanders. Bernie has been going to the Midwest, he's been going to central red states, and he's been holding rallies, and he's been saying all of this in his classic Bernie patois. It needs to be said, Democrats really do need to take on the moneyed interests. I've been waiting for them to do this, Michael, for 40 years. And maybe, when the dust clears and settles on this horrendous administration, or I call it a regime, and it is more of a regime than an administration, maybe the Democrats will then have the courage of what should be their convictions.
Amen.
Amen.
I will be hoping and praying on that one right alongside of you. But I actually wanted to ask you, just to go back to the economy for a second. I feel like there was something that came up this week about how the top 10% of all Americans now account for over half or roughly half of all consumer spending. Now, that stat didn't strike me at first, but then I started thinking about it and I was like, how is that even possible? And I thought to myself, who would have the answer to that? Perhaps Robert Reich. What's going on there?
Well, here, this is a trend. Like all economic data, you take a snapshot, but the snapshot only becomes significant if you see it in context of what the trend line is. And 20 years ago, the richest 10% of Americans did not account for half of consumer spending. They accounted for maybe a third of consumer spending. In other words, inequality of income was not nearly as great as it is today. And the fragility of the United States economy is in part related to this fact, because as the economy depends on fewer and fewer people who have the money to buy the goods and services that the economy produces, then if those people, that top 10%, get suddenly fearful, as they became fearful this week, then the economy is very, very vulnerable to sliding off a cliff. When more and more people are part of the economy, that is, they have money in their pockets to spend, the middle class, we used to have in this country a very large and enlarging and a middle class that got bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, that was a steadying influence in the economy. As the middle class have shrunk, and the working class has shrunk, and the poor have got more, a larger proportion of the total economy in terms of the numbers, not the money, but the numbers of poor and the numbers of working class. The economy cannot sustain the kind of blows that it is now beginning to take.
And Bob, I mean, rich people can only buy so many things, right? Like Elon Musk only needs so many Cybertrucks in his garage, and Bill Gates only needs so many personal computers. Like that, they cannot single-handedly sustain an economy based on consumption, right?
And that's one of the things that is not talked about nearly enough, Michael, in terms of inequality. As inequality soars, as more and more of the money and wealth in this country is in the hands of fewer and fewer people, then the economy becomes far, far more vulnerable to shocks. Louis Brandeis, we were talking about the turn of the century and the first Gilded Age and the parallels between right now and 100 years ago. Almost exactly a century ago, the great jurist, Louis Brandeis, said America has a choice. We can have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both. What Brandeis didn't say is we also have a choice. We can have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have an economy that works really well, or we can have an economy that is vulnerable to recessions, depressions, and you name it. But we can't have both.
Yes, definitely right, Bob. And I think that the American people would agree with you. I think I'm curious to see how people are going to feel as prices continue to rise, despite the promises of the Trump campaign to do otherwise, whether that be because of mishandling ongoing crises like the avian flu crisis or raising tariffs arbitrarily on friendly nations. I mean, how are we going to solve the housing crisis if lumber from Canada is being tariffed out the wazoo? It just doesn't seem realistic.
Exactly. But it's also oil from Canada we are dependent on. In fact, Donald Trump, in his desire to isolate the United States economy and isolate the United States and really expunge and deport 10 or 11 or 15 million workers here who are here technically because they don't, illegally because they don't have documentation. Combine that with the tariffs, what he is doing is essentially jeopardizing the paychecks of millions and millions and millions of Americans, subjecting this economy to a downdraft. And let me remind you, Donald Trump was elected not because people loved him. Most people don't like him. He was not elected because people want to get rid of immigrants. He was elected because of the economy. He was elected because most people want prices to come down. And what he is doing in all of his initiatives is sending prices up. In fact, there was one very important survey this past week showing that most consumers fear now higher inflation and have more expectations of inflation than they've had in many, many, many years. So you can imagine the buyer's remorse that many Trump voters must now feel.
And not only that, I mean, even outside of economic approval, his general job rating has dropped. I believe the day of his speech was the first average net negative, or the average negative rating, approval rating. And that was, less than 50 days into his presidency? I mean, that's unprecedented, right?
Yeah. I mean, the honeymoon, as they say, is over. More Americans now disapprove of Trump than approve of Trump. 60% of independent voters, not talking about Democrats, independent voters, disapprove of Trump. He's heading into territory that would normally be considered to be extremely dangerous, particularly with regard to elections. This year, and especially next year. Next year's midterm elections, unless Putin gets very, very active, and I wish I were being totally ironic about this. Trump is going to lose, and the Republicans are to lose big time in the House and the Senate.
And you mentioned Putin. I guess to broaden out our perspective here for a moment, how do you think, I mean, first of all, how do you think Putin is feeling watching all of this from afar? And how do you see the U.S.'s role in the world evolving over the next couple, I mean, I'd say years, but it seems like weeks or days based on the choices made by this administration?
Well, it's amazing how much can happen in a very short time, particularly in terms of foreign policy. You know, a lot of foreign policy scholars and observers think that foreign policy is the last thing to change when you have a new administration. But actually, I've been surprised how quickly this has all changed. Putin. I mean, we know that Trump loves Putin and has kind of made every attempt to create an alliance with Putin. Trump is even telling right now that the refugees from Ukraine who are here legally have to now go back to Ukraine. Because he wants to make lovey-dovey with Putin. But what this is also doing at the same time is causing the Europeans to come together. They are pledging a great deal of money, not only for Putin, but they are also at the same time, and this is something that was not covered very well in the news, they are striking trade deals with Latin America, with Mexico. They are creating a kind of European world, a common market that excludes the United States. So we're going to have the United States over here alone, and Europe and Latin America, and who knows, this is also very good for China. China is very active. China is opening consulates around the world, even as the United States is closing them. So Putin is delighted. China is delighted. America is becoming more and more isolated, and we, because of that isolation, are becoming more jeopardized economically and politically.
Well, I have to ask, again, as somebody who's only lived 28 of the 78 years that you have lived, have you ever felt that the global perspective on the United States has shifted so quickly before because of actions taken by administrations?
Not as quickly, no. I'm old enough, Michael, to remember that when John F. Kennedy was elected, there was a kind of you can almost hear the cheering around the world. There was a sense of enthusiasm and excitement. And it really did spread around the world, even to Eastern Europe, even to the Soviet bloc. But no, this is something quite new. And in fact, let me ask you, I mean, granted, there are 50 years between us, Michael, but how do you, and I don't expect you to have the presumption to speak for your generation, obviously, Gen Z? Do I have that right? Gen Z?
Gen Z, Zoomers, as a counter to Boomers.
I mean, what do you think about what's going on? How does this all seem to you? You don't remember Richard Nixon, obviously. You don't remember, you were not there in the Nixon administration. You were barely sentient in the George W. Bush administration. So how does this all strike you?
I think it makes me sad, honestly. I think that I was raised to believe in, a certain set of ideals that this country stands for. And obviously, it's very difficult to live up to ideals, but more often than not, I hope that was something that our leaders wanted to do. I'm less confident of that now. And I think that you see that in the cynicism among a lot of young people in general, whether it be about foreign policy or, now, just about everything, it seems, when you're looking at what this administration is doing on a daily basis.
But also, even before
Please.
this administration, excuse me for interrupting, Michael, but even before this administration, Gen Z, your generation, was being really badly treated by the economy. I mean, you couldn't get housing. Housing is almost out of reach for your generation. Starting families is almost impossible for your generation. I mean, you look at boomers like me, you probably say to yourself, well, you boomers got the advantage of being the first movers 50 years ago in terms of the economy, in terms of property and home and housing and families, and we are suffering. Your grandchildren, in effect.
Doesn't feel great, Bob. Not gonna lie. But I at least personally am hopeful that there are enough young people, well, enough people of all generations who understand, the importance of all of these programs that are on the chopping block right now in terms of securing our future and trying to do more. Right? That's more than just retaining them. Right? I think that a lot of this was built up over the course of one or two terms in FDR's administration or one term of LBJ. Like, we can do big things quickly in this country if we really want to. And I think that's what's been giving me hope.
Well, my formative years, Michael, were in the civil rights movement and in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And so my optimism about people power comes from years when actually we did prevail. I mean, the ideals are still there. We have not achieved the ideals, but we did a pretty good job in terms of the beginnings of the civil rights movement and getting out of Vietnam. So my sense of efficacy and agency comes from those years. But what about you and your generation? I mean, 50 years hence, where do you get any sense of efficacy and agency? Where do you draw from?
That's a good question. I think it's been difficult to say, if I'm honest. I suppose there are individuals that I can point to. I think I've been very inspired by the work that Congressman Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, has done, just being a vocal spokesperson for working people. I mean, that is a total change from what I experienced even when I was becoming politically aware in high school in the early 2010s. And I am hopeful that more people like her will both run for office. I mean, Maxwell Frost is another good recent example. He's around my age, and he was one of the people holding up a sign. He's one of the people who gives really visible press conferences, people who are digitally literate, like yourself. You're a TikTok star. But obviously of all generations, right? I think that, it's a different landscape now in terms of how to reach people, and finding folks who are both effective warriors for the working class and able to talk on Instagram and do a regular TV hit and, go live on Twitch, and all of these things are going to be the people who lead us to success, at least in terms of communication.
So, Michael, I've got, this all brings up a question I'm very curious about. I mean, where do you get your information? Where do you get your news from? I mean, I don't expect you to talk for the entire generation, Gen Z, but, I'm old enough, I read the newspaper, I read the New York Times, I read, I'm old enough, I read a physical newspaper. People think I'm a little crazy. Young people don't even know what I'm reading. What do you do for news?
So I get most of my news from social media, like many people in my generation. I think it used to be more Twitter. These days it's more Blue Sky. But I also like to get my news from what I'll call news aggregators. So people that have all of the headlines for the particular day on one big page. It just makes it very easy for me to get a wide view of the landscape. But I think that from what I can speak to for my peers, there's a lot of folks who basically only get their news through social media, whether it's by clicking on somebody's story on Instagram or occasionally, maybe they'll wander on to what is now x.com as well. But I do think the interesting thing that I don't have the answer for, but I'm going to start asking around, is that there's a lot more young people who are completely uninterested in being on social media for all the reasons you'd expect. They don't like Mark Zuckerberg. They don't want their personal information out there. And if you're not on social media and you're not subscribed to a newspaper and you're not reading the news online and you don't watch TV, I actually have no idea how you're hearing about what's happening in the world other than through your community. So
how about Substack?
Substack.com. That's true. That's a good point. I think there are a lot more people who are directly subscribing to folks who were either previously journalists or public figures or public officials like yourself. And I'm hopeful, actually, that we're going to start to see more movement towards independent outlets, and that's how people are getting the news. I myself have come across a number of excellent newsletters when covering all of this DOGE stuff from people who previously worked for big publications and are now independent, which is great. Like, obviously a big change from the algorithmically driven social media, news focus.
Well, final question for you. I find that in this emergency we are in, and it is an emergency, some people have opted to think of this as sort of normalize it. This is all just politics as usual. Some other people, and I think the second fallacy is just as dangerous, have said there's nothing that can be done. It's hopeless. The apocalypse is coming. Let's just all wait to the end of the world. I think that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, that kind of hopelessness. Where are you, and where do you suspect? And again, I don't want to put you in the position of speaking for the entire Gen Z, but where do you suspect a lot of your friends and acquaintances really are on that kind of frame?
I think that there's still a lot of uncertainty. And I think that, honestly, even until this week when we started to see more signs of vocal resistance from the Democratic Party, a lot of people were feeling very lost. I mean, who are the leaders? Who is in charge of figuring out what we're going to do next, either within this administration or whatever comes after? I don't know. And I think that until we start to see some more assertive leadership and visible leadership from folks in opposition, I imagine people are still going to feel very uncertain and, wanting to stick their heads in the sand. Though, I mean, given how radical the first, 50 days of this administration has been, I suspect there are a lot more people paying attention than if they had done these things quietly.
That's what I want to end on, actually, that note, because it seems to me, when I'm feeling at my most depressed state over the last 7 weeks, what I tell myself is that the more that the oligarchy and the nihilists and the dictatorship, anti-democracy people, the more they reveal themselves, and as they are revealing themselves right now, the more the opposition has an opportunity to organize and mobilize and energize. What we've had for years now is that these people, the oligarchs, the anti-democrats, small d, have been in hiding. But under Trump 1, they started to come out of hiding, and now they are there. The moneyed interests, the big money, the billionaires, the CEOs who couldn't give a shit about average working people, they are now making themselves very clear, which is good, Michael. I think this is good.
Yes, well, I hope that others will see what you're seeing, and I think that there are signs of that already.
And on that optimistic, on that upbeat note, I think we will end. Michael, thank you so much for filling in for Heather. You did a wonderful job. I also want to thank very much Naomi Bradford, who is part of Inequality Media, Civic Action, Inequality Media. Naomi, you are there behind the cameras. You do the editing, and you've done a fabulous job. Thank you. And as for the rest of you, we've made it through almost 7 weeks. Of the hardest 7 weeks I remember. Just remember, the honeymoon, Trump's honeymoon, is ending. We're seeing the end, the beginning of the end. Keep the faith. Bye-bye.